Watching the oil and gas business the last 17 years has been one of the most pleasurable things I've had in my entire life. Now we're getting 28 million pounds of sand. Well, it's coming in 800 to 2,000 barrels a day. Decline curves look like this. And the quantity of oil and gas extracted is probably as much as we need to pay the well out in 18 to 36 months. You know, I have to say, watching the oil and gas business the last 17 years has been one of the most pleasurable things I've had in my entire life from a business perspective. Watching the engineers and the experts in oil and gas figure out and solve the riddle to the puzzle of how you get oil and gas out of a shale formation. You see the shale? It doesn't look like it has oil and gas in it. It's brittle, it breaks, it just looks like chert. But if you compress that with 2 miles of earth on top of it, and you compress all the dead plants and animals, the organic material, and you cook it with enough magma from the earth inside, the earth is basically just a big pot of boiling rice. All of a sudden you have this very tight, wet concrete shale with limited pore spaces and limited permeability. What you have now is you have this massive container of some of the largest reserves in the world of oil and gas, but it won't flow without some kind of stimulation or treatment. So what happened back in the middle 1990s, okay, we had an innovation or a re-establishment of what it took to make oil flow. And what we were able to do is we were led by George Mitchell with Mitchell Energy. And George Mitchell said, when I take a core sample of this shale back in the 1980s and 1990s, it is some of the highest organic content of any formation he's ever cored. It has to have commercial oil and gas. I just got to figure out how to do it. So the first thing he decided is, I can't drill a vertical well. I got to drill straight down. I need to have that well bore, that 7.5-inch well bore, I need exposed to more of that rock. So he goes sideways, 1,000, 2,000 feet. Tools were somewhat limited back in the day. But he was looking to expose the well bore to get more access to the rock that contained the organic material of some of the highest content organic material of any reservoir in the United States. So he drilled horizontally. It improved production, let's say 5 or 10x, but it cost 4 or 5x, so basically it was par. 50 barrels a day drilling it vertically, 500 barrels a day, hypothetically drilling it horizontally. That wasn't the ratio, it was more like 5 barrels versus 50 barrels. Cost went from $1 million to $2 million. Okay, I'm still not making economic sense, but I'm improving. Then they decided the way we're gonna have to be able to get this shale to flow, we gotta frack it. Well, how are we gonna frack it? Well, the best thing to do is put back in the ground what came out of the ground. Let's take sand, and let's put sand and inject it into that shale, and let's shatter it. Let's break it all up. So instead of being hard compressed, almost like a granite piece, let's go down 1.5 miles, 2 miles in the ground. Let's over-pressurize it. The reservoir pressure is 2,000 pounds per square inch. Let's shove sand in there, but let's put 10,000 pounds of pressure at the wellhead, and let's force the sand out into the reservoir and shatter it. And when it does, it's going to create natural pathways instead of having almost no permeability where we have pore space, but they don't connect. What you have is low permeability. We have pore spaces, but they don't connect. Let's make them connect by shattering the rock through a frac process. They did that. But the advancement over the last 25 or 30 years is they started off with a little bit of sand. They said, you know what? Let's dump 800,000 to 1 million pounds of sand in a 1 mile lateral, 4,000 feet, even 2,000 feet. So they would go down, they'd perforate holes in the pipe. Once they drilled the well, they would try to put a plug between it, and they try to inject 200,000 pounds of sand across 200 foot of lateral distance. Well, that worked okay, except for one thing. You take that sand, you heat it up correctly, turns into glass. What does glass do when you step on it? It shatters. So they injected the sand with small quantities. The heat of the earth made it brittle, made it look like glass or feel like glass, very crystallized. The weight of the earth collapsed, and those fractures that were created by injecting the sand, they came back and they healed and they sealed. The decline curve started like this, straight down and leveled off. Everybody knew we were close to the solution, but it wasn't looking like what we needed to make this massive encourage, hey, this is the panacea solution for oil and gas exploration in the United States. But we did do two things. We proved horizontal drilling gives us better access to one of the richest fossil fuel materials in the world, shale. We also realized that by fracking with sand and fluids, we could get fractures into that rock, and it worked. Now we have to tweak it, we have to perfect it. So they started adding more sand. And then they added a different type of sand. And they added a different type of sand, but more sand. And then finally they figured out sand was the solution. We started off with maybe 800,000 pounds of sand. We were using this really fine white sand out of Wisconsin, takes down the Mississippi River, goes to the intercoastal, that gets shipped on trains out to West Texas. It was extremely expensive because they said the geometrical configuration of that white sand was so good it would hold the fractures open. That was about a 3 or 4 year nonsense. Finally, when the crash occurred in 2015, they said, forget the fancy sand, doesn't work. Not paying for it, can't make it work. How about if we just try using more local sand, but let's try to maybe use the local sand and we'll put in maybe 1.5 million pounds, maybe 2 million pounds, because it's a lot cheaper, right? We can afford more sand, and maybe the key is not just putting geometrically perfect sand that holds the fractures open, but by dumping more sand in, maybe the fractures won't heal. So they went from 2 million pounds to 8 to 12, 13 million pounds of sand. It worked. It worked because now when they fractured, even with the heat and the pressure and the overburden of the earth pushing down, it kept the fractures open. So now the decline curves where two things happened. The initial rate went from 300 barrels a day to 700, 800, 1,000, 2,000 barrels a day. Decline curves went out further. It made more reserves, better recovery, faster economics, more economics because you're producing more early. What it also figured out is the decline curves weren't so sharp. With a small amount of sand, we were getting decline curves that did like this and dropped off 70, 80% in the first 24 months. Now they have wells 5 years ago that were coming in had a 65% decline curve, but it started 4 times higher volume. So I made all my money back faster and I had much more reserves in place. Today, it's totally different. It's just advanced. Now they know a couple things. We're not going to put small sand. We're going to put maximum sand. We're going to inject 25, 30 million pounds of sand in a 2-mile lateral. And what we're going to do is we're going to isolate it every 100 feet. So we inject enough sand in that one interval that it shatters the heck out of the shale and allows maximum pore space to be accessed to maximum fractures, which allows the longest continuity of that oil and gas molecules moving over the next 25 to 50 years. And it worked, and that is a success. Now what they're perfecting is the quantity, the pressure, the time, the amount, the distance. They're watching decline curves. They're doing analysis. And they're saying, what do we do to tweak every step of the way? But what I wanted you to know is the oil and gas business has evolved in what I thought was really great fracking and drilling. Let's call that in 2010 when I started off in North Dakota, Williston Basin. I was like, man, these are 300, 400 barrel a day wells, great wells. We're still making 40, 50, 60% per annum returns. Those wells today are dinosaurs compared to what we did in 2015, 16, 18. And then you add on top of that the improvement, what I just described, and now we're getting 28 million pounds of sand, wells coming in 800 to 2,000 barrels a day, decline curves look like this, and the quantity of oil and gas extracted is probably as much as we need to pay the well out in 18 to 36 months. The entire industry is evolving every day with better technology, better engineering, and better process. I thought you might like to know what has changed so dramatically in the last 15 years. 2008, shale's going to work. Put the sand into it. 2010, it's the type of sand, it's the quantity sand. 2015, let's put more cheaper sand. 2020, let's put a lot more of the cheaper sand. 2026, let's put all the sand we can, as cheap as we can, do it correct with a better process using technology and software. Now what you're getting is the very best of the best, but this is how we've evolved over the last 15 years. Thanks for listening.